from the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
Even the best lobbyist doesn't necessarily have access to the president or the vice president or even members of the cabinet. But CEOs can engage, and they do engage at that level. In fact, that's the message of the power of the money, that CEOs are the wild card or the potential tiebreaker.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Tevi Troy, author of the new book, The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and titans of industry. We talk in depth with Tevi Troy about that book a little bit later on in today's program. First, we're joined by Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. He is Wayne and Marcia Buske Distinguished Fellow in History at Hillsdale College, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, also the author of The Case for Trump, newly released in paperback with a new foreword, and also recently The End of Everything. You can find his work at victorhanson.com. Dr. Hanson, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me again.
A pleasure to join you. We talked today some high-level concepts and ideas about this presidential race. As we talk today, it's just a little bit since the Kamala Harris interview on CNN, her first interview since becoming the Democratic nominee. And she said multiple times during this interview, when asked about her flip-flops or change in positions, that she hasn't changed her values, but she has changed her positions. What does that mean to you, that someone can say that she maintains the values but changes positions?
Well, I think it's an admission, and the only way a layperson would interpret it is that I've had to change my values for political expediency as they're reflected in my positions. So for the next 70 days, I want to assure people in my base or support that I'm still very, very to the left of things, but I'm going to have to manifest a conservative patina or veneer, not unlike the MAGA agenda on the border, on crime, on the economy, on foreign policy. But I can assure you that I haven't changed my values, and that means in 70 days when the election is over, whether I win and I'm going to be the president, I will revert back to policies and values in synchronization. And if I don't win as vice president, I will finish out the next 3.5 months as the hardcore progressive that I am. I think that was kind of I guess what I'm trying to say, Scott, if she had to do it over, she wouldn't have said that. Mm-hmm.
We heard in 2008, the Obama campaign, Obama himself said he wanted to fundamentally transform America. Yes. Kamala Harris in the CNN interview talked about leaving behind the past decade of politics in the U.S., a clean break. She's the change candidate, even though she's been vice president for the past 3.5 years. Why does it seem that over and over again, progressive candidates feel the need to not just break from policies of the past of their opponents, but policies of the past of those of their own party?
Yes. Well, on the face of it, it's absurd because out of the last 16 years, 12 years have been under Democratic administrations. Mm-hmm. And in her case, by 2000, after they were elected and took office in 2021, they had the House and the Senate and the White House. So they could have done, and they did, anything they wanted. The problem they all have, that includes Clinton, Obama, Biden, and Harris, is they have visions or agendas that are not predicated on popularity of 51% support. They derive their support from the institutions, K through 12 academia, corporations, foundations, the media, big tech, Hollywood entertainment. And they feel that that influencing dynamo can substitute for popular support. So what they traditionally do is they have this left-wing message, and then you saw that at the convention. Nobody really believed that people on the left chant USA, USA, mm-hmm. and they had the flag everywhere, and she's going to have these positions. But nobody really believes that that's what they believe or they will rule. And they understand that they're on the wrong side of popular support. So they use mechanisms, denial, veneers. Old Joe Biden from Scranton, the centrist unifier. Kamala's not from Berkeley anymore. Now suddenly she's grown up in poverty in Oakland. She's not the child of 2 PhDs. In her case, I will say it's a little different because when Clinton ran in 92, he was running against Read My Lips, No New Taxes, and an unpopular George H.W. Bush, who was being drained by Ross Perot. In 2008, Obama was running against an unpopular Iraq war, which, by the way, had always pretty much wound down with the surge, but he was still saying that it was a lost war, and the 2008 financial meltdown. When Joe Biden ran in 2020, he was running against the satanic, supposedly Trump, and Charlottesville, Russian collusion, all that. She, unlike her 3 predecessors, is running against herself. So and that came up in the interview, but was not followed up with a follow-up question. Essentially, she's saying, I am running against myself. I was vice president for 3.5 years. I had this agenda that I no longer own, and I really can't claim that it wasn't my true feelings, because I have said on the record that I was the last person in the room when we made these decisions, and I support it, and I'm a big supporter. So what I'm now saying is, well, as vice president, I didn't have the exact authority to come fully into the office as I will as president, but I'm not going to tell you where I differ from Joe Biden. And so the obvious, and then there's the corollary to that, and the corollary is, well, you're still in office, and you have a president that's been on vacation for over 30 days. So in theory, your office should be exaggerated and magnified in a way we haven't seen. So you have 5 months. You've got all of the end of August, September, October, November, December, January. Go to it. Get this agenda that you're running on. Go to Joe Biden and say, well, you know, if you want to take a vacation, fine. I need to implement this. I got to close that border, build the wall. And I've got to stop spending money, and I've got to raise the defense budget, and we got to frack. And that's not going to happen. Whatever she says, people will either say one of 3 things. Well, then you're just criticizing yourself and Biden because you've been in control with the Congress, or you can still do it right now, and you're vice president, so you can implement this agenda, or you've now disowned Biden completely, and you're now free to say that you never agreed with anything he did.
Talking with Victor Davis Hanson here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, victorhanson.com for his work. You wrote a piece a few weeks ago advising President Trump and the campaign to get out, to show everyone who Kamala Harris is, to find her. Ask that question, why she won't run on her record. And at least to this point, the response from the Harris campaign to those type of questions is simply, I don't believe that anymore. Maybe I did then, I don't now, I'm a different candidate. What's more powerful in a campaign that is now reaching its stretch run? The ability to replay those comments from 5 years ago, 4 years ago, where she very clearly defines what she believes, or having a campaign surrogate try to explain it away by saying she just simply doesn't believe that anymore?
Yes. Well, it's a little bit tricky because while she says she's for fracking now and that she's for a closed border now and she's for policies that include building the wall now and a defense budget build-up now, she never quite says, but I'm against the new Green Deal and I'm against fracking and I'm against clamping down the border. So it's sort of like a medieval palimpsest. They just superimpose a new Kamala Harris's position on top of the old one. And even though they're antithetical to each other, she never makes that distinction and she never tries to square that circle. What she does maybe on a Friday night or something, an aide will come up and say, well, you know, off the record, or maybe I should tell you, she no longer supports bans on fracking, but she has never said that herself. She's never disowned that. Right. And that tells us that she's going to revert back to those, and then so that her critics won't say, well, you were for A, then you were for B, and now you're for A, and it's all predicated on the election cycle. It's just superimposed. It's like she's for everything. I'm for fracking. I'm for against it. I want a secure border. I want an open border. And it's incumbent upon Trump to focus on that. It's very hard, I understand, with this iron dome around her of media protection. But what they are hoping is to replay the Joe Biden playbook. She's secluded because while she's not cognitively challenged, she's just as linguistically challenged as Biden was, and she doesn't do well. So they want to seclude her, and then they want to outsource the campaign to the media, political surrogates, and the big money to run. She will outspin Trump as Biden did.
Yes.
And then under the guise of COVID, they won't really campaign openly as Biden did. She'll have a little bit more problem because there's no COVID, but she'll do the same thing. And as Joe did, he ran as a centrist and a unifier. As soon as he got into power, he was the most left-wing president in modern memory. So she's running as a centrist and unifier, and she calls it joy and vibe rather than hope and change. And then finally, they count on Donald Trump to call her stupid or not black, and that loses 6 or 7 hours of the news cycle because then the left goes crazy. They defend it. Trump's independent voters say, oh, my God, he's making it socially unacceptable for me to vote for him. And then he recovers, goes back to talking about her record. But in the process, you've lost 24 or 48 hours in a 70-day cycle. The whole thing, the way to look at it, I think, is there's only 70 days because they put her in there, anointed her coronet so late in the cycle that they're running out the clock. And they have a much better chance of running out the clock than they did with Biden, who at least was known in campaigning and in primaries for a year and a half.
We will continue our conversation with Victor Davis Hanson in just a moment. First, I want to ask you to take a moment now. Head to podcast.hillsdale.edu/subscribe. Right there, you'll find every show we offer on the Hillsdale Podcast Network and easy links to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. You could also find these shows wherever you get your audio. But at podcast.hillsdale.edu/subscribe, you can click through and be taken immediately. That way you'll never miss an episode. Who will Hillsdale President Larry Arnn have on the show next? You'll know if you subscribe to The Larry Arnn Show. Which online course will be offered next? Find out if you're subscribed to the Online Courses podcast. Or if you want to get absolutely everything the Hillsdale College Podcast Network produces, you, my friend, can sign up for the super feed and get everything the HCPN produces at podcast.hillsdale.edu/subscribe. Take a moment now. Subscribe to your favorite shows. Maybe find a new favorite show at podcast.hillsdale.edu/subscribe. We continue our conversation now with Victor Davis Hanson, Wayne and Marcia Buske Distinguished Fellow in History at Hillsdale College and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Dr. Hanson. It seems to me, to summarize what you've explained, is Democrats this cycle seem intent on running a combination of the past two successful Democratic presidential campaigns, which is the 2008 Obama of he's an avatar, he is whatever you think he is, he's for this, he's against the same thing, and at the same time, the 20 Biden campaign, which is avoid questions, avoid the media, let them do the work for you. It's an amalgam of those two campaign ideas.
Exactly, and she's saying, I'm a fresh, young, dynamic black woman, just as Barack Obama came in. I'm a moderate. I laugh. I'm not a radical. These people who call me radicals are demonizing me, just as Obama said the same thing. And just as Obama, he at one point earlier in his career had said there are no red states, there are no blue states. We're all together, unity. And then he turned out to be the most divisive president in a generation. And it's the same playbook that she's doing. But she has a little bit more problem than Obama, as I said, because they were running against Republican incumbents, both Biden and Obama. She's not. She is well known in a way that Obama wasn't. Not that she's been vice president for 3 years, and people have seen her. And then third and most important, Bill Clinton and Obama, if they saw a microphone and a camera, they were like a magnet drawn to it, and they were masters of extemporary speaking. Not that they said anything, but they were very fluent and mellifluous. She's not. She sees a camera and a mic, and she goes in the opposite direction.
Yes.
And that's something. So the challenges to do what they did with Biden and Obama are much greater now because of the lack of COVID and the lack of a Republican demonized administration and the lack of her skills. And so it's very eerie that they really were anti-democratic in the way that they selected Biden in 2020 by kind of forcing all the other candidates out of the primaries, even though Buttigieg, Warren, and Sanders had more delegates, and then sort of covering up his cognitive challenges, and then having him serve as a vessel for a much more left-wing agenda than people had thought, and then suddenly deposing him when he blew up in that stress test historic. We never had a debate before the candidates were nominated. He was forced to do that. And then when he blows up, they tell us, I guess indirectly, he's not fit to be our candidate, but he is fit to be your president for the next 5.5 months. And then we're not going to have an open primary, and we're going to anoint his successor, who has never run in a single primary and never won a delegate in her life through voting.
Talking with Victor Davis Hanson here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Pleased to have him in studio here in Hillsdale's campus for this conversation. You wrote recently about the Democratic campaign being projectionism at its core, to its core, you wrote. And I think about this line of attack that I guess Governor Tim Walz began, where Republicans are weird. And that was embraced by Democrats everywhere and used during the convention. Is that another example of that projectionism, where they are what they say, they're going to throw it on the opponents to deflect the attention away from themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big Freudian, but Freud was onto something in his 19th century work when he identified a psychological mechanism that people have, that when they're insecure or they feel vulnerable or they're hypersensitive to criticism because of that vulnerability, one of the defense mechanisms that the persona has is to project your weaknesses onto another person and to criticize them and direct attention away from themselves. So we're now in this Orwellian situation where Trump is weak on China, Trump is weak on the border, Trump is supposedly weak on foreign policy, Trump is weak on crime, she's a crime fighter, she's a border hawk, she's a China hawk, she's a Pentagon hawk. And what she's basically saying is, he is all the things that I was until about a month ago. And that's a losing portrait. So I was being demonized, so I'm going to demonize him by transferring the objections to me onto him. And the way Freud explained it, it's very successful because the projectionist knows better than anybody what their own vulnerabilities are, so they can project them and describe them in detail and why people don't like them onto someone else. And they tend to do that. And so when your point about weird is very well taken. What is weird is, for the first time in history, deposing a president by threatening the 25th Amendment. We have mechanisms to get rid of a president. We have the 25th Amendment, we have resignation, we have impeachment, but just to force him off a ticket, but to keep him in the White House, it doesn't make any sense. And then we've never had a vice president. Even Harry Truman had to go to a convention and get delegates when Roosevelt kicked Henry Wallace off. But my gosh, she's never won a single delegate by a vote. This is weird. And then when you look at some of the appointments, the nuclear waste czar who was stealing women's baggages, the transsexual surgeon general or whatever, head of the health bureaus, they have or the trans, in one case, topless person during the Easter egg hunt at the White House. So in traditional terms of being weird, this administration's very weird. So what they do is they project onto J.D. Vance and say he's really weird.
Back in 2016, when Donald Trump ran for president the first time, defeated Hillary Clinton. During the debates, he, I think, scored points and was willing to go to a place to identify Democrats' extremism, particularly on abortion. This time around, we have these extreme ideas on the left that Kamala Harris has embraced to expand the Supreme Court and pack the court, to eliminate the filibuster in the Senate, price fixing on food items, taxing unrealized gains, which is a ridiculous kind of concept. Would you advise Trump and the Trump campaign take the same strategy with these extreme Democrat ideas this time around?
Well, you were right. In that debate, it was very effective because he was being attacked as someone who would deny a woman reproductive rights. And he said, whatever you say, Hillary, there's 10 or 12,000 births, and that's a lot. That's what he said. I know there's 1 million abortions, but 10 or 12,000 were a viable he didn't even use the word fetus. He said a baby is viable outside of the womb and has to be murdered. And you support that. And that shocked everybody because they never talk about that. Mm-hmm. And I think and Trump has to select things that have shock value. Otherwise, he's not going to get the attention of the public. That is one issue that worked well. He can do it again. Another thing he needs to say is these people, in theory, when they say they want taxes on unrealized income, that can be investments, your home, or anything. So they will pick an arbitrary date, and then they will hire legions and legions of inspectors that will go over your financial portfolios and claim at a peak point. And remember, they will not look at a low point. They will look at the peak point of your investment during a boom, and then they will want you to borrow against your home or your investments to pay them. And that will shock people if they say that, or if they say, if you discover something and it's unique and you have a patent on it, Kamala Harris is on record that she should have the power to take away your patent if she feels it's injurious to her agenda, and he's got to do that. What he can't do is scowl while she's debating and say that's stupid, or she's dumb, or you just now were black, or these are radical communist ideas. He just has to go into detail. It doesn't have to be a lot of detail, but as you said about abortion, on all those issues, once he can get a 60-second description, it will shock the American people. They're not signed up for that.
Talking with Victor Davis Hanson, more at victorhanson.com. Kamala Harris has this line, unburdened by what has been. My colleague here at Hillsdale, Dr. Miles Smith, wrote a piece recently, and he wrote, every totalitarian state in modern history has been predicated on the belief that humanity can start anew, cleansed of imperfections of what has been. Can we connect that favorite phrase of Kamala Harris? Yes,
I do. It's I call it the year zero phenomenon, and every radical bloodthirsty regime, whether it was, I remember as a classical graduate student in classics, I once picked up an esoteric German publication on Sparta, and it was published, I think, in 1934, but I didn't know that. It said year 2 on it, and that was when Hitler was made chancellor. And the Jacobins during the Reign of Terror of 1792 and 3, they started a year zero. And anybody who talks about we're going to have a fundamental transformation of the United States in 7 days, I think Obama said, or we're going to redo everything, and we know where that leads. It leads to renaming buildings, streets, the days of the week, years. And that sounds absurd, but when we had the woke founding of the American 1619, Hannah Nicole Jones had told us that was the real date. And so when it's always an indicator when you tear down statues or you rename buildings or streets or you change the dates in a foundational sense that you're trying to remake society in a 360-degree, 24/7 fashion.
One final question for Victor Davis Hanson. As we hear Kamala Harris explain herself and stake out these positions, often now we find her taking very similar positions to Donald Trump, whether it be the border wall, which we now see highlighted in her ads, this idea of no tax on tips that President Trump first introduced on the campaign trail, What does it say to you that someone as far left progressively as Kamala Harris feels the need to also claim these ideas that Donald Trump has brought forward into the campaign?
Well, I think it's an indication that they had the 8 years of the Obama administration, and they've had 3.5 or more than 3.5 of the Biden, and there really are no new ideas. And the ideas that are new, whether it was the Iran deal or playing Iran off against Israel, or the idea we're just going to leave Afghanistan, or maybe we'll be a cosmopolitan society, global village, and we won't have a border, or, critical race and critical legal theories say that the laws don't represent any human phenomenon. They're constructs of a rich, exploiting white male class. So if you go into a store and you steal sneakers, it's against the law only because rich, white, privileged people don't steal sneakers. So they make these laws to punish people, kind of out of Les Miserables. So they know that all of these theories and all of these policies and all of these agendas didn't work. And they know that to the degree that people bring up that they don't work, they're going to lose. And so what they do is to try to project sometimes, but also appropriate policies that do work. And that's what we're seeing right now. Everybody who looks at the border says to themselves, when Donald Trump left office, he had fought for 4 years people within his own administration, never Trumpers, that tried to sabotage his border in Homeland Security. Anonymous, remember him?
Yes.
He had fought the Pentagon, who would not allow troops to be used. He had fought lawyers who cherry-picked judges. He'd fought them all, and he finally had won, and there was a secure border. And she and Joe Biden, by executive fiat, destroyed it. And now what's strange about it is, because it was destroyed by fiat without getting any legislation, it can be restored by fiat, and it could be restored quickly. She could do it tomorrow, so could Joe Biden. And so he needs to point that out, and I hope this campaign is going to boil down to, I think, 3 things. One, she's not going to talk to any reporters. She's not going to have a town hall. She's not going to do anything. Even this latest interview, she had to have the emotional support, kind of like a pet rock or something, with Tim Waltz. And it had to be edited, and she wanted notes. And even when I looked at the tape, it looks like she was looking down at times as if she had notes. I don't know. And she's not going to do that. So how do you bring her out? And the only way you bring her out is to be ahead in all of the sort of even the bias polls by 3 to 4 points. How do you get ahead by 3 or 4 points? You were very, very disciplined. No personal invective, no ad hominem, no cul-de-sacs on the campaign trail or media cycles. Just explain her issues, show who she is, and if that will convince the American people they don't want it. They don't want the agenda, and then she will try to double down and have to come out. But that has to be compressed into 70 days, and so each day matters.
Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Wayne and Marcia Buske, Distinguished Fellow in History at Hillsdale College, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, also author of The Case for Trump. They had a paperback with a new foreword out now, and recently The End of Everything, all his recent writings at victorhanson.com. Dr. Hanson, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
Up next, we talk with Tevi Troy, his new book, The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and titans of industry. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Great books, great people, and great ideas. Knowledge of these things is critical to becoming a well-educated human being. That's why I'd like to tell you about an easy and enjoyable way for you to listen and learn whenever and wherever you want. And that's through the Hillsdale Dialogues. If you haven't heard about the Dialogues, once a week, Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn joins radio veteran Hugh Hewitt to discuss topics of enduring relevance. From time to time, they also talk about current events, but always with an eye toward more fundamental truths. And they want you to listen in, to join a conversation like no other. The Hillsdale Dialogues are posted every Friday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check us out on X. We're at Hillsdale Radio. We're joined by Tevi Troy. He is a best-selling presidential historian, a former senior government official, and the author of the new book, The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between Commander-in-Chief and the Titans of Industry. You can also find him on X at Tevi Troy, and the book has an X account at CEOs and POTUS. Tevi, thanks so much for joining us.
Scott, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
This is a blast of a book to read. It's fun. At the very beginning, you make this delineation or help us understand the difference. I think people look at Washington and think the lobbyists have the power. But CEOs play a big part in this too. What are the differences between what CEOs can get done in Washington and what lobbyists can get done in Washington?
Well, it's a question of level. I mean, even the best lobbyist doesn't necessarily have access to the president or the vice president or even members of the cabinet. But CEOs can engage, and they do engage at that level. In fact, that's the message of The Power of the Money, that CEOs are the wild card or the potential tiebreaker. They can come in and talk to the president and sometimes even change their mind. I know we're both big fans of Ronald Reagan. There was a free market regulation that he was trying to push through, or his staff was trying to push through in the Reagan administration about syndication of television shows. And Lou Wasserman, who was his old agent from Hollywood and was the CEO of Universal, came to see him and convinced him not to go forward with the regulation. That's not anything a lobbyist could have done. That had to be done at the CEO to president level.
Love reading about Lou Wasserman. I just finished reading the memoir from Bertie Brillstein, the famous Hollywood agent, and there's a lot of stories about Lou Wasserman in that book as well. Why should we care about this? Why should the public be concerned about the access and the potential of CEOs having influence in the White House with the president?
Well, that's a great question. And if you had asked that question 150 years ago, when I started the book, or when the book starts, it would have.
It just
been,
felt like you started the
care.
book 150 years ago.
Right. It took 4 years, not 150.
Yeah.
But there would have been no reason to care about it because big business wasn't that important in our daily lives. There were no corporations to speak of as we have them today, and big government wasn't that important in our daily lives. The only interaction you had with the federal government was when the post office delivered the mail. But now, big government regulates your schools and regulates your food and regulates and subsidizes the roads you're on. So they shape everything we do all day. And big business, they regulate or they put out the phones that we're doing this interview on, the entertainment media we watch, the cars we drive, the fuel we get from the car. So they have a say in our daily lives in a way that neither entity had 150 years ago. And now they're dominant in every aspect of our lives. And it's something we need to be thinking about.
Tevi Troy with us, his new book, The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and the titans of industry. 18 CEOs profiled, looked at throughout the course of the book, some of them with interactions with multiple presidents over time. We won't talk about all 18, but we will talk about a few of them. And we start at the beginning, the blank slate, as the chapter title says, Rockefeller and Morgan early on. And those guys took different paths and different strategies in their dealings with the White House and the commanders-in-chief. How did that work out for them?
Yes, absolutely right. And by the way, every one of the 18 CEOs had interactions with multiple presidents. That's kind of the strategy of the CEOs I profile in The Power and the Money. It had to be somebody who had interactions with multiple presidents so you can compare and contrast how they do. But Rockefeller initially just wanted to ignore government. He thought it didn't matter. And initially, when he started his empire, it really didn't, because they had no regulations or regulatory apparatus with which they could do anything to him. But over time, and as his unpopularity increased, suddenly the Sherman Antitrust Act happens, and Teddy Roosevelt gets the Bureau of Corporations approved. And Roosevelt starts attacking Rockefeller personally from the podium. And so suddenly the White House matters, and Rockefeller was too late to pivot to it. Morgan, in contrast, He wasn't beloved by presidents, but he wanted to be helpful. He goes down multiple times in the 1890s and in 1907 to help try and stave off financial crises, and is relatively successful at doing it. It doesn't make him popular again, but it does kind of give him a grudging respect from the president that he helped.
In the chapter about Teddy Roosevelt and Rockefeller, as a media guy, I loved the anecdote about how the media helped shape perceptions of Standard Oil, of Rockefeller, and especially the writings in McClure's magazine. How did McClure's help shape the public opinion of Rockefeller and Standard Oil, and how did that influence his influence with Teddy Roosevelt?
Yeah, it's a great question. There was a woman named Ida Tarbell. She was a 6 foot tall, dogged reporter who was going to kind of uncover the ugly truths about Standard Oil. And she writes this multi-part series about Standard Oil. The country is riveted. Teddy Roosevelt's reading it. And there's this perception created of Standard Oil as this very sharp-elbowed, monopolistic company. And that is true. That's part of the story. But the other part of the story is that Rockefeller made this empire where there was nothing, where there was complete confusion in the oil industry. The reason they named it Standard Oil is because he created a standard for what oil products should be. Before that, they were either volatile or unreliable. And so he was kind of regulating in the absence of government. There was no government to regulate oil. He was doing it. And so Rockefeller, there were pluses and minuses on Rockefeller, but the McClure's thing makes him look very bad. And Teddy Roosevelt uses that to his political advantage and eventually brings about the breakup of Standard Oil, which takes place after Roosevelt is no longer in power because it required the Supreme Court to rule on it. But it was definitely set in motion by Roosevelt.
Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company is dealing with multiple presidents. There's a wonderful story about him being kicked out of the White House by Woodrow Wilson. But Ford says at one point, "We, Ford, may help the government. The government cannot help us." At the time, was he right?
He was right. The government, however, could hurt. And Ford really objected to the Blue Eagle of the National Recovery Act, which is this government standard of approval. I call it in the book quasi-fascistic, and many other historians have called it that as well. It's basically the government saying this company is okay because it's doing what we want. Mm-hmm. And Ford didn't much like that. He said, "I don't want that darn buzzard on my business." But Ford was right in that he built his own automobile empire in the absence of government, without government help. Kind of stark contrast to Elon Musk, who builds Tesla with a lot of government subsidies. And Ford kind of sees government as an annoyance. Sometimes he likes the president, sometimes he doesn't. But he tries to find ways to criticize Franklin Roosevelt when Roosevelt's in the White House. But then later, once World War II starts, he builds the biggest armaments plant in the U.S. at Willow Run, and they get a lot of money from the U.S. government. And so then suddenly you find out that the government can help.
Talking with Tevi Troy, his new book, The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and the titans of industry. Henry Luce from Time magazine, the writer and publisher, as we slide forward into the 1950s, in fact, and the Eisenhower campaign in 1952. How did the 1950s and Luce show the potential benefits of his approach in influencing the president and the presidency?
Well, Luce is actually one of my favorites to profile. In fact, it was the first chapter I wrote in the book, just to get a sense if I could do this with following one CEO across multiple presidencies. And he starts off by having very bad relations with Franklin Roosevelt, whom he despises. But then he takes a different tack with Eisenhower and is incredibly supportive of Eisenhower, gives him some campaign aids, helps promote the Republican foreign policy platform in the pages of Time magazine, gives Eisenhower very favorable coverage. And in some senses, it might have been too favorable because there starts to be this sense among the smart set that Time is kind of in the tank for the Republicans. In fact, there's this joke that goes around that Time is very even-handed. Half the time it praises the Republicans, the other half it bashes the Democrats. So I think this creates a blow to Time's reputation. It used to be a pretty well-respected magazine, and then by the late 50s, because of its strong support for Eisenhower, it becomes seen as kind of middle brow, and the intellectuals start to denigrate it.
I want to come back now to Lew Wasserman, the Hollywood agent who re-enters the picture or re-enters the book around this time, and his dealings with Lyndon Johnson specifically. I love the painting of this picture that you have of Johnson and Wasserman sitting talking until very late in the evening, in fact, into the early morning hours. The point being, president can be a lonely job, and the CEOs or titans like Lew Wasserman are among the rare peers with whom presidents can relate. Do you see that developing over time in these relationships between these two powers?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And thank you, Scott, for the careful read of The Power of the Money, because one of my themes is this idea of the loneliness of leadership, that presidents see something in CEOs because they feel like they're at the same level and nobody else is. Even your vice president, your chief of staff, they all are beholden to you in some way. But a CEO of a big enough company, you kind of have a respect between one another, and also a sense that they're equally lonely, right? Everybody in their company is either gunning for them or looking for ways to get their favor. And so they don't have real peers either. So a CEO and a president like Wasserman and Johnson can have a real relationship in a way that many others can't have with presidents.
Talking with Tevi Troy, his book, The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between the commanders-in-chief and the titans of industry. Lee Iacocca, another car maker, is also featured in The Power and the Money. Was with Ford, fired because he was not well liked, and went over to Chrysler. Ended up getting the bailout from Jimmy Carter just before Carter left office, and then had to deal with Ronald Reagan. And you explained some ups and some downs in their relationship. But I saw you say that Iacocca, post-bailout in the early 80s, mid-80s, began to see the federal government as a protector of Chrysler. Was that point of view essentially obvious at that time or before that time, or did Iacocca kind of figure something out?
Yeah, it was not at all obvious. In fact, when we first meet Iacocca in the book, he's a pro-free market, anti-regulation Republican who's going to the Nixon White House to argue against Ralph Naderite type regulations on the car industry. And suddenly, once Chrysler is kind of knocked off its pedestal by foreign competitors, in large part because of unwise union labor contracts that make them make the car companies in America less competitive and have them making less successful cars at higher prices. So he starts looking for government for help, both in the form of bailouts, which he does get from Jimmy Carter, and then he starts looking for protectionism, trade barriers against Japan and other foreign competitors to help his company. And Ronald Reagan, as we mentioned earlier, is free market, and sometimes he was amenable to lobbying from CEOs, but not always, because he did have his philosophy and a philosophy that I know both of us appreciate. And so Reagan would entertain Iacocca. In fact, Iacocca was one of the most well-known and popular people in America at the time. He had his best-selling memoir was the #1 best-selling book in 84 and 85. He was even on an episode of Miami Vice, which I know as a pop culture guy you'll appreciate.
Yes.
So Iacocca was huge, but wasn't huge enough to convince Ronald Reagan of Iacocca's interventionist schemes, including one is where he wanted a federal gas tax because he thought that would be beneficial to the car companies. And Reagan puts him down by basically saying, well, we're not going to do this, Lee, and that's why you're on that side of the desk and I'm on this side, putting Iacocca in his place.
Moving forward a bit, there are a couple of CEOs who at least begin their time, or titans, not just CEOs, begin their time attempting to stay out of politics. Oprah Winfrey, Steve Jobs. Can they do their work without being in politics? Even Bill Gates, at the beginning of his run at Microsoft, is concerned with keeping Microsoft under the radar, not dealing with government. But as the book continues, they all end up involved in some way. When do they understand that what they do almost necessitates this role with the commander-in-chief?
It's a really good point and a good question, Scott, and it happens in different ways for different people. So Bill Gates really tries to take the Rockefeller approach. I'm going to be too big for government. I don't have to worry about government. We're 3 times faster than the private sector in the tech industry, and government is 1/3 as fast as the private sector. That means we're 9 times as fast in his calculation. Maybe not wrong, but he was wrong that he thought he could avoid government. And so he recognizes at some point that government's part of the picture, but it's after he is no longer CEO at Microsoft and may have left because of the antitrust actions that the Clinton administration took against him and his company, and his unwise efforts to just fight it hammer and tong as opposed to trying to come to some accommodation with the government. And so he tells Mark Zuckerberg years later, get an office there now, saying you need to take Washington into account. Steve Jobs, because he sells a product that was kind of a higher end product, it's less subject to regulation somewhat. And for the most part, he stays away from government, but he sees the advantages in the government going after Microsoft and does kind of give them, the government, some advice and suggestions for how to go after Microsoft. And he builds some friendships with Bill Clinton a little bit and Barack Obama a little, but he wants to stay away from government. He just is not a big fan of it. And for the most part, he was successful in staying away and also building a hugely lucrative company. And then Oprah Winfrey, she starts to recognize her political power after she's comfortable in her show. For a long time, there was a no politics on the show rule. Mm-hmm. And then in the 2000 race, she has both Al Gore and George W. Bush on, and both of them see big bumps in their approval after appearing on Oprah. And this was astounding to people. And so then she takes it a step further in 2008, when for the first time she endorses a candidate, and that's Barack Obama. And she's been kind of out of the closet as a liberal Democrat ever since then.
Tevi Troy with us, his book, The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and the titans of industry. Sometimes there's not clashes, though, and sometimes, at least temporarily, there are these leaders who are altruistic in their nature. I look at Jamie Dimon, J.P. Morgan Chase, in the midst of the recession in 2008 and the melting down of the stock market and the uncertainty on Wall Street. There was a national purpose involved in his work with George W. Bush, in which his company ends up taking a bailout that it did not need, and in the long run might have harmed the reputation of the company.
Yeah, what Dimon sees is that he needs, as one of the biggest of the bankers, he needs to send a signal to Wall Street that it's okay to accept this bailout. And even though his company doesn't need it at the time, and even though he recognizes that government will impose strictures on his company that he doesn't want to deal with, he takes the bailout. Now, he does pay off the money sooner than anticipated to relieve himself of those strictures, which kind of angers the Obama administration. But he was trying to be altruistic in helping the U.S. government and the U.S. economy stay afloat. And he has been, and I think he comes across pretty well in the book, as a pretty savvy player who knows how to work both sides of the aisle. And I notice this quote that I use in the book about him. He says he's barely a Democrat, which I think is a clever formulation, because Democrats aren't used to having Wall Street bankers as being on their side. So they like the Democrat part. Mm-hmm. And the Republicans like the barely because that suggests that he's opposed to the excesses of the woke progressive.
Tevi Troy, the last chapter deals with Obama, Trump, Biden, talks about big tech domination. So there's Zuckerberg, Elon Musk. I don't want to talk about those guys, though. I want to talk about someone who's actually not in the book, or actually I think there's one reference to him throughout the book, and that's Jeff Bezos of Amazon. And I'm just curious as to why he didn't make the cut as a guy who controls Amazon, certainly a big tech dominator. It also controls a major media outlet in the Washington Post. What about Jeff Bezos?
Yeah, it's a good question. And as I said earlier, I kind of tried to establish these criteria for which CEOs get in. And I had these index cards with the CEOs and the number of presidents they interacted with and the industries they were from and their demographic profiles. And I was trying to get a mix of people. And I just didn't find enough interesting or compelling Jeff Bezos interaction with president stories. Now, in more recent years, I guess in the Trump years, I guess there was a little more, but there just wasn't enough to make him an interesting and compelling character based on his interactions with presidents. And some CEOs choose that approach. They say, I'm not going to play in the Washington sandbox that much. And for Amazon, it worked. But for other companies, it's a more dangerous approach.
Tevi Troy, presidential historian, former senior government official, and his new book, is The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and the titans of industry. You can find him on X at Tevi Troy, T-E-V-I, Troy. And the book has its own X account, too, at CEOs and POTUS. Tevi, thank you so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks for having me, Scott. I'm a big fan.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Victor Davis Hanson, Wayne and Marcia Buske Distinguished Fellow in History at Hillsdale College. More at victorhanson.com. And Tevi Troy, his new book, The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and titans of industry. Remember, you can hear new episodes of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews, including Victor Davis Hanson this week, on the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.